13 members of the House of Lords work for or have shareholdings in companies that are linked to Israel's arms trade. This even includes a British lord who chairs a company owned by the State of Israel. Joining me to discuss this revelation is my colleague John McAvoy, who wrote the article on our website exposing these links.
Thanks for having me, Phil.
John, we've not been able to do a video like this for a while because we've both been off sick and we're still getting over our colds, so I apologise for the bad sound quality on this video. But the article you've done, I think, is really important. I was keen to discuss it as soon as possible. You looked through all the House of Lords registers of interest to track down which members had financial ties and employment ties to arms companies involved in the conflict in Gaza. And one of the most shocking examples that you found of this involved someone called Lord John Hutton. For people who've not heard of him before, could you tell us who he is and what is his connection to the State of Israel?
Yeah, for sure. So John Hutton used to be the MP for Barrow and Furness. One of his advisors at the time actually is John Woodcock, the current MP for Barrow and Furness, who's now in receipt of pro-Israel lobby funds and trying to crack down on protests, pro-Palestine protests in the UK. But as the MP for Barrow and Furness, John Hutton was promoted to Trade Secretary, also Defence Secretary. And it's not included in this article, but I went through, the WikiLeaks files to see if anything came up about John Hutton. And in around 2008, he's kind of telling the US Embassy in London that he's getting tired of public service. He wants to go into the private sector.
This was back in New Labour days, right? Tony Blair, Gordon Brown appointed him to those cabinet positions, and then he's one of many of these New Labour figures who have then done very well in the private sector after they've left government, right?
Yeah, exactly. Tony Blair included, but we won't go down that path today. So he does a stint in a number of different private organisations after leaving government. I think it was in 2009, and so he eventually ends up in 2022 joining a company based in Newcastle called Pearson Engineering, and he joins it, I think, 8 days after the company gets acquired by Rafael. Now, Rafael is one of Israel's biggest arms corporations. It supplies many of the bombs and weaponry that's being used to decimate Gaza at the moment. It's also owned by the Israeli state. So basically, Hutton joins this company that's just been acquired by, an Israeli state weapons firm. And it's quite clear why Hutton's seen as an asset to this organisation. He's currently a member of the House of Lords. He sits within influential circles. His experience as a former defence secretary, at which time he was actually named in a lawsuit over UK arms sales to Israel, clearly is going to be valuable to the company as well. He assumably has ties with the Ministry of Defence and procurement in the Ministry of Defence as well. So this is what kind of value these kinds of people bring to arms companies, and in this case, an arms company that's owned by an Israeli state weapons firm.
It's extraordinary because the only other place I've seen this being reported is Press TV, the Iranian state broadcaster. And of course, if this was someone who was working for an arms company that was owned by a foreign power accused of genocide, if it was any other country other than Israel, this would be being reported as a major scandal. But obviously, because it's Israel and people just seem scared of talking about these things, it's just been completely swept under the rug. And so there's no inquiry into Israeli state influence in UK politics and the House of Lords, like we would see with Russia or China. But if you go on Pearson Engineering on Companies House and click on who is like the significant, who has a significant stake in the firm, it comes up as the State of Israel's finance ministry. And that's because, like you say, it's been bought by Rafael, which is an Israeli state arms company. So the link there is crystal clear. This is a British lord who chairs an arms company that's owned by the State of Israel, and that state is under investigation for genocide in Gaza.
I mean, it's incredible, isn't it? And to add to that, I mean, Rafael, the CEO of Rafael in Israel, has recently been tasked with leading the investigation into Israel's killing of 7 international aid workers, 3 of whom were British. So the CEO of Rafael, whose largest client is the IDF, which stands accused and was responsible for killing 7 international aid workers, has been effectively tasked with investigating themselves. It's absurd, but obviously now we have a British lord who is working for a subsidiary company of Rafael. As you say, I mean, if this was Russia or China, there'd be a public inquiry.
And just sticking with this theme of former defence ministers, because Hutton isn't the only New Labour ex-defence minister, right, who's gone down this path. You found someone else called Baroness Taylor of Bolton, who works for a French arms firm called Thales, which has heavy involvement with Israel. Is that right, John?
Yeah, exactly. So she's on the board of Thales France. She was also a defence minister in the Labour government, the new Labour government. Sorry. And while she was in the new Labour government, she was already developing ties with Thales in the UK. Thales was basically an important, well, it continues to be an important manufacturer of the Watchkeeper drone for the British military. The Watchkeeper drone, this is basically a massive Ministry of Defence funded project to produce drones for the British military. These drones are based on the Israeli Hermes drone. So effectively what we're seeing, as the campaign group War on Want noted, is that Israeli drones are being tested out on the Palestinians, and then the technology is being exported abroad as battle tested and used by the British military.
John, the Hermes drone that you mentioned, that is manufactured by Elbit, right? Israel's largest arms company, which Thales has a joint venture with.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So Thales UK, the kind of UK branch of Thales, which is headquarters in France, they operate a joint venture with Elbit Systems, Israel's largest weapons firm, and the subsidiary is called UAV Tactical Systems. And it's them that produce many key aspects of the Watchkeeper drones.
Thales have absolutely stacked their company with these British lords. So they've also got as advisors Baron Arbuthnot, who was a former chairman of the House of Commons Defence Select Committee. They've got Lord Houghton, former General Houghton, who was Chief of the Defence Staff, the British military's most senior soldier. And they've got Lord Powell of Bayswater, better known as Charles Powell, who was Margaret Thatcher's chief advisor for defence and foreign policy throughout the 1980s. So, I mean, they've really got the kind of cream of the British elite, haven't they, on their company payroll?
Yeah, exactly, yeah. And I mean, it's a similar case as John Hutton. You can see exactly why these arms firms find it useful to get all these former British army officials, former defence secretaries, defence ministers onto their payroll, because they hold influence within the British government, and they presumably have a lot of influential contacts, and they understand how power within Whitehall works.
Yeah, and another company that you looked at, which I think is really alarming, is BAE Systems, who make the rear fuselage for the F-35 jet. We know that 15% of parts for the F-35 are made in the UK, but the rear fuselage is made by BAE Systems. And then that's exported to the US, and then the US hands out these aircraft to Israel, which uses them to bomb Gaza, and it bombed, I think, the Iranian consulate in Syria. They used an F-35 to do that. And you found that at BAE, you've got Lord Mark Sedwill, former UK National Security Advisor, former Cabinet Secretary. And he's a non-exec director at BAE since November 2022, so not long after he left Whitehall. The revolving door spun into action. And there's a couple of other lords there who have shares in BAE.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, Phil, BAE Systems, kind of Britain's flagship arms corporation, produces some of the key parts for the F-35s, known as the most lethal fighter jet in the world. As you mentioned, they've been used again to decimate Gaza over recent years. Mark Sedwill, the non-executive director of BAE Systems, is an interesting case because he recently went, I think, on the BBC or another kind of daytime television show, and suggested that it's important that the UK government publish its legal advice on arms sales to Israel. And he wasn't convinced that Israel was complying with international humanitarian law. Yet at the same time, he works for, or is working with, BAE Systems, an arms manufacturer that is profiting massively from Israel's genocide on Gaza. So I think he needs to get his ideas a bit more clear in this regard. Does he support Israel's war on Gaza, or does he not?
I came across Mark Sedwell a few years ago when he popped up in Oman working for the which is a autocracy. The Sultan of Oman was he was the longest serving dictator in the Arab world, ruled for 50 years, and he had this secret privy council of British elite that he flew out on his private jet every New Year for this all-night banquet where they gave him advice on defence and foreign policy and the economy. And Mark Sedwell was one of the members of this secret privy council. So again, it just shows how kind of well connected he is. And these are exactly the kind of figures that BAE want to have on their board. BAE, of course, sold lots and lots of weapons to Oman as well. So that's the kind of circles that he's moving in. John, who else was there that we haven't mentioned yet?
Yeah, so Lord Peach works on the board of Martin Baker, which, as you recently reported, Phil, makes the explosive cartridges for many of the ejection seats for the F-35 warplane. So these are a really integral part of the plane. As you reported, they probably couldn't function without it. And of course, within this context, Martin Baker sells a lot of these explosive cartridges, which get sold on to the F-35 jets, which are sold to Israel, and then are used within the bombardment of Gaza. So there's another example of a British lord who's linked and working for an arms organisation that profits from arms sales to Israel.